In the name of the Integrated Research Training Group team, Henriette Mühlmann, Jenny Hund, and Ulrike Kremer, I would like to welcome you to this evening and welcome to our speaker today, Professor Staffan Müller-Wille. Staffan is a historian of science and a professor of the University of Cambridge. And let me briefly introduce tonight's speaker. After studying geology and paleontology, Staffan left the field. In 1997, he received a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Bielefeld. Then he worked as a curator at the German Hygiene Museum, Deutsches Hygienemuseum in Dresden, and before he moved to the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin in 2000. And after then, in Berlin, he moved to the University of Exeter in 2004, where he also co-director of the Center for the Study of the Life Sciences until 2019. Since 2020, Staffan Müller-Wille is professor in history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. Staffan's research has focused on the history of taxonomy, the cultural history of heredity and races and kinship in anthropology. And as you say on your website, Staffan, you are particularly interested in historical epistemology, how knowledge is produced, how it changed in time. And doing these, you work on detailed case studies in the history of science in the early modern period. Among your huge number of publications, I would like to mention just 2 books. Together with Hans-Jörg Reinberger, you published the book Vererbung, Geschichte und Kultur eines biologischen Konzeptes, Frankfurt 2009, translated in English in 2012. Published under the title A Cultural History of Heredity, and the book Das Gen im Zeitalter der Postgenomik, eine wissenschaftshistorische Bestandsaufnahme, came out in 2009, published in English again under the title Gene in the Postgenomic Era. Dear Staffan, you are here in a place that must be quite familiar to you, as you are also a honorary professor at the University of Lübeck and here at the Institute of the History of Medicine and Science Studies. Despite of your busy life outside, you are perhaps also come to feel somewhat at home here in Lübeck. I'm very much looking forward to your lecture, Sex and Gender in the History of Life Science. Dear Staffan, welcome. You have the floor.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Aha, that was German. So you're being recorded now. So thank you very much, Birgit, for this very kind and above all correct introduction. People tend to get things wrong when they survey what I've done over time. And I feel very much at home here, not only because of the honorary chair, and I spend a little bit of time every year in Lübeck, but also because I grew up in Kiel. And as you can imagine, those of you who have been in Kiel, we were always envious about the Christmas market. So during Christmas, there was always a visit to Lübeck. Okay, well, let's get started with the lecture then. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's not only an occasion to visit Lübeck again, which I always do with a lot of pleasure, especially during this time. But it also offered an opportunity to synthesize some thoughts on a theme that my research touched upon again and again, but that I never sort of addressed systematically or head-on. And that's, of course, the theme in the title. Now, Birgit mentioned that a lot of my research takes the form of very detailed case studies. But there's another mode that I also sometimes use, and that is to look at the history of science in the longue durée, in the very long time span. And I will perhaps take that to extremes in this talk and introduce you to what the ancient Greeks thought about generation and things like that. And perhaps I will even try to defend the thesis that there is nothing new under the sun. That's sometimes something that historians like to do, point out that whatever appears brand new has already been there, preferably among the ancient Greeks, but sometimes also in other civilizations. Anyway, so let's see whether I can handle the technology. No? No? I can do it on the computer, yeah. This doesn't work for some reason. Okay, so let me begin by explaining where I come from in talking about sex and gender in the history of the life sciences. Birgit mentioned books that I published with Hans-Jörg Reinberger, and here you have one of them on the cultural history of heredity. There were also edited volumes, all in all 3 edited volumes that came out of this project. So I showed the first here. And they came out of a project that I led together with Hans-Jörg from 2000 to about 2012. It's not so clear when that project actually ended. It was funded in a very peculiar way by the Principality of Liechtenstein. And so it was easy to get at least a little bit of money every year. And it carried on and on. So this project was quite interdisciplinary, quite broad. We looked at the longue durée of the history of concepts of heredity, and there were 3 main conclusions. First, that heredity was a metaphor that entered biology from law in surprisingly late, namely in the early 19th century, before life scientists, physicians, natural philosophers did simply not use this metaphor when they talked about generation and reproduction. Before people began to talk about heredity, discourses about generation and reproduction were focused on the momentous act of procreation of an individual. Heredity, to sort of become a metaphor that was useful to employ, needed a switch in perspective from being focused on the generation of individuals to reproduction in populations and across generations. And this switch was facilitated by what we called epistemic spaces. So breeding practices come in, the record keeping of breeders, but also in important ways, certain institutions like mental asylums that collected data that allowed to treat this data statistically and allowed to take in this perspective on populations and generations. And then around 1900, the discourse that had developed by then around on that basis on heredity crystallized, so to speak, in what one can call an epistemic object, and that's the gene. And the gene came into being famously, of course, in 1900 through the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work, but it remained throughout the 20th century and also into the 21st a concept in flux, as we argued. It developed, it was subject to changes in technologies, but also calculational practices throughout the 20th century, and acquired ever new dimensions, so to speak. So those were the arguments, and they perhaps illustrate the way in which we pursued this project in terms of a history of concepts. So that is sometimes also referred to as historical epistemology, a tradition very strong in France. And one of its more peculiar outcomes is this famous book by François Jacob. Of course, he received the Nobel Prize for discovering gene regulation together with Jacques Monod and someone else whose name I now forgotten. It always happens, and it's not in my notes. François Jacob nicely illustrates. It's a book I can really recommend, this kind of approach to the history of science. So the most important thing about this approach is that one does not take concepts for granted, but tries to locate their origins, to explain their entrenchment through practices and media of research, and sometimes, of course, also their demise under new historical conditions. So concepts can also die out in the course of history. Now, throughout our project, we were aware of a blind spot, and it's also a blind spot in this magisterial logic of living systems, as it's quite correctly translated in the first edition in English, La logique du vivant. And that blind spot was the heredity of sex and the role of gendered concepts shaping notions of heredity. Heredity itself, of course, was very much a gendered concept. Usually when people talked in the early modern period about heredity, what they had in mind was what was called primogeniture, or inheritance by the firstborn son. Yeah? But despite these quite obvious connections, we were not quite able to find a lot of literature tracing the history of gendered concepts of inheritance in medicine and biology, and also not many colleagues that could help us sort of with this aspect. I will mention one of them later on, Helga Satzinger, but there weren't many people around, or at least that was our perception. Yeah? In hindsight, now that I've sort of done all this work for this presentation, we could perhaps have made a better job, and I also don't want to exclude the possibility that we weren't able to do so because both of us were men. So perhaps it wasn't really our first priority of interest. In any way, now let's turn to the topic itself, and I want to talk to turn to the topic of sex and gender in the history of life sciences by first making a comment on the present literature on this subject, because that divides up in a peculiar way the contemporary literature on sex diversity. I like the title of this project. It's a nice, happy word, sex diversity. That falls into two big strands, and they become more and more pronounced, especially in the past decade, I would say. On the one hand, there is a growing flood of literature using biology as a resource to point out how sex binaries fail to capture diversity, the diversity of gendered relationships within diverse species. Yeah? So you can learn about mushrooms and reptiles and various ways of sex determination. A classic book about that, this is the cover of the 10th anniversary edition of the book, is by Joan Roughgarden, Evolution's Rainbow. Roughgarden in this book argues that on the level of genetic reproduction, there are not really genders. They are sort of not visible on the level of genes and molecular genes. And if we turn to phenotypes, we see that there's always a multiplicity of genders, and they do not simply map on a male-female binary, and that species are, as she puts it at one point in her book, multi-gender societies. So that was the argument in her 1994 book. On the other hand, you have a strand of literature that one can maybe classify as critical, that sees in science a powerful facilitator of naturalizing and reifying gender stereotypes that need to be deconstructed, and a lot of work is invested into this. So the example here is Sarah Richardson's Sex Itself, a wonderful book, and she also has a big project that I'm sure many of you will be aware of. So it is a little bit as if the life sciences themselves point us in two directions at the moment. On the one hand, the life sciences celebrate diversity. There's so much weird stuff out there in the jungle, so to speak, in the field. On the other hand, it looks like the life sciences are always engaged in imposing some form of order onto life, and that one sort of needs to resist that tendency in light, or to defend diversity. Now, this is also reflected in the historiography that exists on the history of sex and gender in the life sciences. As so often, it is the 18th century which is seen as a crucial transition period. As Roy Porter and George Rousseau has put it, it's the twilight zone in the history of science. That goes back, I think, to a metaphor that Hegel used as well. A twilight zone where the pre-modern meets the modern, where everything that is good, but also everything that is bad about the modern originated, and where the modern takes shape and begins to replace the pre-modern. And for our theme, there were two very important publications in the early 1990s. Londa Schiebinger's Nature's Body, often seen as a classic in the feminist history of science, feminist historiography of science. In her book, Nature's Body, Londa Schiebinger argued that the 18th century saw the naturalization of gender difference in classification systems that were proposed during that time. I will explain that in more detail later. And the second book was by Thomas Laqueur, Making Sex, wonderful title, who argued that in the 18th century there was a transition from a one-sex model of sex gender to a two-sex model of sex gender / gender. Before the 18th century, in a nutshell, again, I will explain that in more detail, women were conceptualized as lesser men, while after the sexes appeared as two incommensurable entities, sexes. Both Schiebinger and Laqueur argued that these shifts, the naturalization of a binary gender hierarchy, resulted from the challenges to patriarchic order that came with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So a kind of counter movement to movements that argued for more equality, etc. Now, both books have been heavily criticized, and especially Thomas Laqueur's book. There is almost an industry of Laqueur bashing by a lot of feminist historians, especially medieval historians, but also ancient historians of medicine and science. And the criticism covered both the chronology, the idea that in the 18th century you have this shift, but also the way that Schiebinger and Lacour read the sources and allegedly misunderstood a lot. In Germany, Michael Stolberg has published a very noted paper in the big history of science journal ISIS that smashed Lacour in particular, but also Schiebinger. So it is easy to show that statements about sex being somehow grounded in nature long predate the 18th century. You find these statements in Aristotle, you find them in medieval authors, etc., etc. And on the other hand, it is also very clear, and Lacour was himself very clear about that, he actually said so, that after the 18th century, you still find developmental ideas about sex. Development, especially the idea that both sexes develop from some kind of non-sexed entity, embryonic entity. So in a way, the one-sex model persists. That's also quite obvious. And on the other hand, even those authors, especially Galen and Aristotle, the big giants of ancient medicine and life sciences, who believed in strong analogies of the male and the female sexual organs. That's these famous images on the right. And who believed that there is a developmental series from female to male, could hold very strong binary views. So they could be very strong about that there are really normally only women and only men. Yeah? And the two are sort of metaphysically necessary. Yeah? So I will come back to Schiebinger later, but I want to spend a little bit of time on Lacour first. So one of the criticisms of Lacour is that he was very selective in his reading of pre-modern sources. He basically relied on Aristotle for the idea of women as imperfect men, and he relied on Galen's anatomical analogies between male and female organs when he claimed that there was a one-sex model before the modern period. This, as I already mentioned, ignores strong sexual binaries in Aristotle. So Aristotle's theory of generation, most of you will be aware of that, was based on a very strong form and matter dualism. Form is what is active, what is generative, and that was what the male seed, according to Aristotle, provided in generation. The formal and the effective, the moving force, it's what's generative and active. Whereas matter is conceived by Aristotle as being receptive and passive, and that was identified by him with a female menstruum. So, when talking about generation, Aristotle liked to employ artisanal metaphors. He talks about how a smith makes a sword out of a piece of iron, and he has very drastic metaphors. And what he's, of course, actually talking about is the act of sexual procreation. But the most fundamental analogy that strikes us today as strangely misconstrued is agricultural. The male seed is analogized with seed that grains that we distribute on a field, and the female provides the soil, the Boden. Yeah. So that is the most fundamental analogy that is in play here. According to this idea, women are indeed, according to Aristotle, less developed than men. Where the male form has not quite succeeded in impressing itself on matter, female offspring results. And this reflects the idea that when in ancient sources people talk about generation, what they are most interested in is the generation of a male heir. So a son that is not only male, but also similar to the father, ideally. Yeah? That is quite important. Now, I want to introduce you to a book that is strangely overlooked in the history of the life sciences. It appears in German in 1951. Anna Lesky, she was Austrian. I will say a little bit more about her later on. Very learned. You need a bit of Greek and Latin to follow through. Sometimes she also quotes Sanskrit sources because she believes there were lots of influences from India on Greek thinking. Really a very learned book. And she documents the huge diversity of ancient theories of sex generation. And what comes out really powerfully, first of all, is that the generation of the sexes, how sex differences come about, is really the central problem that all of the generation theories in antiquity turn around. That's what exercises them. How do you produce, as I already said, how do you produce a male, ideally? Yeah? That's the question. It's a remarkable book in the diversity it covers, and I can only summarize it very roughly by pointing out the dimensions according to which these theories differed in the ancient period. First, there were various theories of where the seed that comes into play in generation originates. There was the first theory, and a very prominent one, we will see it reappear in the 18th century, that the seed actually is generated by the brain. And then, in a complicated way, transported to the testicles. Yeah. Second, there was a big disagreement between people who thought that it was only one sex that produced seed, namely the male. Aristotle belongs to them. And actually a majority of natural philosophers, that both sexes produce seed, and that then unites and produces somehow through its interaction an offspring. Galen, for example, believes in the two-seed theory. And then thirdly, of course, there was huge disagreements about the mechanisms involved in sex determination. So sex determination is what exercises them. Yeah? Anna Lesky illustrates them through these nice diagrams. They are quite helpful in getting at what all of this means. First, there was the mechanism of epikrateia, as it was called in Greek, and that's sort of a process of overpowering or of struggle, where one side wins at the end. Yeah? Sex determination, according to these mechanisms, involves a struggle. One factor, usually the male, is stronger, hotter, denser, all sorts of harder, all sorts of qualities and adjectives come into play here, than the other, the female. And you can easily think of all the opposites: softer, colder, wetter, etc. But the male does not always succeed. Yeah? So in overpowering the female in this process, and hence you get the different outcomes. So here in the diagram, you can see, maybe that works, how if both father and mother are hot, what you get is a hot male. Yeah? If both are cold, what you get is a cold female. Yeah? And if one is hot and the other is cold, you get maybe a male, but it looks similar to the mother. Very bad. Yeah? Or the other way around. Yeah? So that's the epikrateia principle. Then there was the left-right theory, and I would be interested afterwards to hear whether that's still around. Sex determination depends on which side of the body the seed comes from and where it ends up in the female body. Yeah? So, and again, you see all sorts of combinations and a spectrum of forms that can result from that. And finally, perhaps the most elaborate theory, and also one that historically remained very much in place and in discussion up to the 18th century, was pangenesis, that each part of the body sends off little seeds to the what we would call gonads, and there they sort of work as dispositions for the characters that make up the body, including female and male characteristics. Sex determination now depends on the combination of these particles. And note that, according to this, all bodies are hermaphrodite in a sense. Males contain female parts and females contain male parts. And again, you get all sorts of combinations and a spectrum of forms that result from them. Now, what all of these models share in the ancient period is clearly a developmental perspective and a connection with bodily constitutions. Men are hot and dry. Females are wet and cold. And factors like age, nutrition, climate, etc., all play a role in ancient generation theories. Bodily constitution can have a sex-determining effect, of course, but also the age of a father. The older a father gets, the less the chance that he will produce male hairs. So it's at the prime of your life that you produce males. Yeah? And the second aspect, which is connected with this one, is that the sexes can form a spectrum. Intersexes, hermaphrodites, were part of the ancient furniture of the universe, but a spectrum that was not valued equally across, of course. Yeah? The male was usually valued as a higher form of being, and intersexes, especially by Aristotle, were seen as, in the best case, maybe useless. They have no reproductive function. In the worst case, monstrous. And in the early modern period, you get a huge literature around how hermaphrodites are divine signs for hard times to come, war, pestilence, etc. The third point I want to make is that sex, in all of these theories, is fundamentally a quality, yeah? That comes in degrees. A quality that comes in degrees, but most of the time results in a clear dualism. Yeah? But it is thought of as a quality. A body is more or less female or more or less male. Yeah? It is more or less active, spirited, or more or less passive, receptive. That's the fundamental polarity, one can say, that all of these theories move in a way. Now, fascinatingly, Lesky, throughout her book, matches this diversity of ancient theories with contemporary diversity, in her time, contemporary diversity of sex determination theories. She mostly relies on this book by a not very well-known developmental biologist and zoologist, Johannes Meisenheimer, in which you can already find all the kind of stuff that Joan Roughgarden also talks about. Yeah? Sex determination by temperature in reptiles, fish that change their sex throughout their life, and etc., etc. And Lesky really, one by one, matches all of that in the ancient period. That's quite stunning. I find it stunning, yeah, maybe one day I find a student to work on Meisenheimer. He seems to be quite interesting. Also, the idea that age or nutrition may produce more males or less males is one that survives into the 19th century, and there are huge statistical projects to test these hypotheses. And Meisenheimer covers all of this. You find all of this stuff in there. So what remains of the idea that the 18th century is a turning point? To come back to Lacour and Schiebinger. The one-sex and the versus two-sex model was perhaps a misnomer. In fact, what Lacour stresses in his book Making Sex is a difference in directionality. I haven't found a better word for that. So I quote him on the one-sex and the two-sex model. Difference and sameness, more or less recondite, are everywhere. But which ones count and for what ends is determined outside the bonds of empirical investigation. The fact that at one time the dominant discourse, so this is in the pre-modern world, construed the male and female bodies as hierarchically, vertically ordered versions of one sex, and at another time as horizontally ordered opposites, as incommensurable, must depend on something other than even a great constellation of real or supposed discoveries. So what he hints at here is that sex in the 18th century becomes understood in a way as a classificatory or taxonomic concept. It is not seen as a quality anymore, where you can have more or less, better and worse. Yeah? It is seen as a kind, as a class, as a species. Yeah? Eine Gattung. This, remarkably, is also the emphasis of Lotta Schiebinger's book, especially in Nature's Body, which has a chapter on botanical classifications that makes the point that sex is a modern invention, a modern binary. So I want to say a few words about this now. So the object of Schiebinger's discussion is the so-called sexual system, a system of plant classification proposed by the Swedish naturalist and physician Carl Linnaeus in the 1730s. It classifies plants by the number and arrangement of sexual organs, the stamina and pistils. And this was the very idea that these were sexual organs was a new idea. Yeah, so that he takes up and develops into this classification system. Now, this is the system as Linnaeus presented it. Note that there is a kind of scale from top to bottom at the right-hand side. These are the 24 classes of the system. And then there is a kind of logical decision tree that guides you to these classes. And Schiebinger argued that ideas about gender and sex entered this in two ways. First, there's a hierarchy of male over female sexual traits. So you classify the classes first by male traits, and then you divide up the classes into orders, as Linnaeus called them, by female traits. And secondly, there is a hierarchy of heteronormative over other sexual relations in the scale of 24 classes. So you can hardly read this, but at the top of the scale, you find the monandria, the monogamous relationship, so to speak. But let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The sexual system operated in quite a striking manner at a botanical and a metaphorical level, where anatomy of male and female sexual organs were expressed in terms of relationships between grooms and brides and beds and rooms and things like that, marriages. They were expressed in terms of marriages. The first step of Linnaeus' system was very simple. Can you see male and female sexual organs in the plant, or can you not? So he distinguishes between the cryptogams, mosses, ferns, other primitive plants, as we tend to say even today, or visible, the public plants that display them to the naked eye, yeah, that have flowers. So these are plants with flowers. The metaphor of public versus clandestine reflected the practices among the poor in Sweden to enter partnerships and have children before marriage. They often, you needed permission to marry. You would often not get it, so you just started a family without it. That's what this refers to. And note that the cryptogams are at the bottom of the hierarchy. They are all the way down. The public, the flowered plants were divided further up according to whether sexual organs can be found in one flower or in distinct flowers. Flowers with both male and female organs are hermaphrodites, according to Linnaeus. Both sexual organs are to be found in the same flower, and metaphorically this is expressed as men and women sleep in the same bed. Yeah? They do not always do that. Sometimes they have different rooms, or even live in different houses. We will come back to that. Now, the monandria, as I already mentioned, are at the top. And if you move down, you get more and more polygamous relationships. So you have one woman with 20 men living together with 20 men, or the other way around. That's one dimension. You get misalliances where men of different power enter relationships with women. One can interpret power in various ways here, but monetary or potency. But women have relationships with men of different classes. You get incest, where the marriage partners are relatives. Yeah? Mariti propinqui et cognati sunt. They are related, husband and wife. Moving further down, you even get homosexuality. Schiebinger claimed there's no homosexuality in Linnaeus' system. There is. The 19th class, you find males that form a union with their genitals. Yeah? These are orchids, where the stamina grow out of one base. And finally, various forms of adultery. So you have several houses, and people switch between these houses, go back and forth, and have various. And at the very end, even various forms of prostitution, where sometimes the prostitutes are infertile, sometimes the wives are infertile, but the prostitutes fertile, all sorts of. So what is going on here? My reading of this is that Linnaeus is actually making fun of the very old idea of a scale of nature. Yeah? It's what he presents his students, and these students were all male, some were between 16 and 21. Yeah? What he presents to them is a kind of perverted idea of the scale of nature, a scale of perversion. Yeah? He's making fun of that idea. In fact, there was another presentation of the sexual system that took on a tabular form, a classificatory form. And what you see here is that the plant kingdom presents you with all these diverse ways of making offspring. Yeah? This is arranged according to what we call the Linnaean hierarchy, and in very fundamental ways, I will explain that with another example, the Linnaean hierarchy of classes, orders, genera, species, varieties, etc., allows you to think about difference and equality at the same time. Yeah? So all the different orders that belong to one class are, in a sense, the same thing. Yeah? And on another level, all the different species of one genus are, in a way, the same. They are equal, of equal value, in a way. Now, this also, on a much more deeper level, played a role in Linnaeus's understanding of the sexes in life. So, he was convinced that sexual reproduction is universal among organisms. He was skeptical that there are organisms that only reproduce asexually. We know that's not true nowadays, but still. And he, in particular, of course, claimed that even plants have sex. Why was this relevant? Because according to ancient theories, in order to have sex, you have to have the ability to move and the ability to sense. And plants were believed to lack these abilities. Yeah? Plants do not move and they do not sense anything. So how can they have sex? And Linnaeus says they do have sex, they move and they sense. Yeah, they are as alive as animals. So this was a move against the idea of a scale of nature, a scale of perfection where plants were always seen as lower than animals. They are, in a way, the same. But at the same time, he does naturalize sex in a certain sense. The sexes, according to Linnaeus, are the only natural varieties. All other varieties are monstrous. Sexus varietatis naturalis constituit, relique omnes monstrosa sunt. What does he mean by monstrous? What he means by monstrous in modern parlance is they are caused by the environment. All other varieties within a species are due to the environment. What you see here is that sex becomes a category, a kind. It's not a quality anymore, it's a kind. It sits there as a subdivision, a natural subdivision of the species. Yeah? And now Linnaeus is not the, it becomes a taxonomic category, sex. Linnaeus is not the only one in the 18th century that makes this move. I use him here for illustration. You can talk about Buffon, who does this quite similarly. You can talk about Blumenbach. This becomes the modern perspective on living processes. Species are defined reproductively, and as reproductively defined taxonomic units, it is obvious that the sexes will play a kind of constitutive role within the species. Now, sex at the same time as Linnaeus is active also enters what was known as political arithmetic and what we nowadays identify as the prehistory of statistics. This is a famous publication from the mid-18th century. This is, I think, the zweite Ausgabe. Yes, it's the zweite Ausgabe. The first was 1749, I think. Johann Peter Süßmilch was an early statistician, a church official, and his Göttliche Ordnung, Divine Order, is the first work that shows that no matter where you look in a country, no matter which year you look at, the ratio of male to female births is about, no, the other way around. The ratio of female to male births is about 1,000 to 1,050. And that's divine order. Again, the concept of sex is, or gender is here used in a classificatory way, and it allows to do statistics. It, of course, statistics that has lots of normalizing effects. On the right hand, you see calculations about life expectancies of the different sexes that are quite famous. And we enter the realm of biopolitics, what Michel Foucault has called biopolitics. Now, does that mean that the world was suddenly conceived in terms of a heteronormative binary of male and female, that people saw male and female everywhere? In a sense, they did, but we can use Linnaeus again to show in what weird ways that could be done. If you look at Linnaeus's theory of reproduction, he believes that every individual organism consists of a male and a female substance. The male in animals is identified with muscles, bones, everything that is hard and strong. The female with the nervous system. Yeah? In plants, it's what you find in the middle of a plant, the soft tissue, and the bark. That is the male. Yeah? And these substances in generation come together again and then form new individuals. Yeah? So again, in a way, the old idea that essentially we're all hermaphrodites. We all consist of male and female elements. So this idea of a fundamental hermaphrodism of life continues into the 19th century. I will now conclude by giving you a very quick overview of how the history goes on. Darwin believes in what he called primordial hermaphrodism. He was extremely interested in the distribution of the sexes in various species. He wrote 2 books which are not so much known about botany and the sexes in botany and sexual reproduction in botany. And this is quite an interesting example that he spends a lot of time on, first in a paper, but then also in a book publication. It's Primula, a plant genus, where you find 2 types of flowers, but both flowers contain male and female organs, but they are arranged differently. So in one case, you have the male organs above the female organ, the stamina above the pistil, and in the other kind of flowers, the other way around. And he came up with this diagram illustrating the relationships between what happens if you artificially pollinate these different flower types and the resulting relationships in terms of fertility. If you sort of cross-pollinate, you get complete fertility. If you pollinate within the flower, you get incomplete fertility, and he calls one homomorphic union and the other one heteromorphic union. He doesn't say anything about homosexuality here, but note that, first of all, how do we address a phenomenon like this? Are these different genders? They are dimorphic, yeah? Clearly dimorphic, so it looks like they might be genders. Yeah? but then they contain male and female organs, both of them. Yeah? How do we conceptualize that? And he tries to do it in this way. And the language he used was later exploited by people who advocated the legalization of homosexuality. It played quite a big role. It also played a big role, these publications, in the formation of sexology in the early 20th century. Mendel, of course, has always to be in the history of the life sciences. One thing that is very curious about Mendel is that the first law he formulated, you usually don't find it in textbooks, is the law of hybrid uniformity, which basically says it doesn't matter whether you get a gene from the maternal or the paternal side, they will always have the same effect. So on a very fundamental level, for Mendel, sex did not play any role. He calls both the male pollen cells and the female germ cells, as he calls them, Keimzellen, he calls both of them Befruchtungszellen. And he's going against the mainstream of his time because most botanists at that time still adhere to the idea that male is the mobile phase, the pollen, that which moves somewhere, that which generates into something, as Aristotle put it. Yeah? And the female is what sits there and waits for the pollen to arrive and develop and nurture, etc., etc. It's what generates in itself, as Aristotle put it. Mendel ignores all of this. He talks about what we nowadays would call gametes, yeah? And thinks they are genetically equal. This refers to a really nice article that never came out of the preprint stage by Luis Campos, who looked at one of the rediscoverers of Mendel, Hugo de Vries, and discovers, first of all, that in their private lives, Hugo de Vries and some of his main propagandists and followers were at least homophile, if not, in de Vries we know this very clearly, homosexuals. And they talked about chromosomes in a way, and they looked at the plant in ways that also went against all heteronormative talks. So their choice of model organism, as we would say today, was Oenothera, the evening primrose, where the chromosomes form rings, and then also sometimes these rings add up into chains, and they are transmitted in these conformations. That's why you get big mutations, and Hugo de Vries was a mutation theorist. Now, these complex chromosomal arrangements, are they sexes? Yeah. Are they subspecies? Are they varieties? It's not so clear. And again, one of Hugo de Vries' students, Theodor Stroms, denied to be a homosexual himself, but wrote a very important speech, gave a very important speech that called for the legalizing of homosexuality. So, and again made use of these queer gender relationships in Oenothera to argue his point. So as one of the most famous cell biologists at the time wrote to William Bateson, the inventor of the term genetics at the time, new and queer things continue to turn up in the chromosome business. Yeah, so the word queer was already around. My final example is Helga Satzinger, who has worked on early genetics and endocrinology, especially the geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, and his invention of the term intersexes on the basis of experiments he carries out with moths, and in order to interpret them, also experiments involving hormones, and he's looking at the, and again you get a variety of factors, their interaction and the spectrum from male to female in these moths. Okay, these are complicated histories. I could spend another hour, but I won't. I want to end with a note on Erna Lesky. She herself came out of pediatrics and morphed into a historian. She did a second degree as a philologist, basically, and she became the founder of Austrian history of medicine. So wrote a lot about social medicine, history of social medicine, but also empirical and statistical medicine, the Austrian school of medicine. So you see that something is going on in the first half of the 20th century that is really important. I haven't mentioned Hirschfeld, etc., which all are in contact with some of the researchers I mentioned. So Goldschmidt is in contact with Hirschfeld. So something is happening there that I'm happy to talk about in the discussion. Thank you very much.